Welcome back to Econ Empire. To identify the most formidable financial institution in the history of global economics, one must look past the skyscrapers of Wall Street, the historic banking halls of London, and the shimmering towers of Shanghai's Pudong district. The greatest bank in the world possesses no headquarters made of glass, and still holds no banking license issued by any sovereign state, employs no uniform tellers, and operates without a centralized server farm that can be unplugged, sanctioned, or hacked by intelligence agencies. It is a financial phantom, a pervasive ghost within the machinery of the global economy that, despite its lack of physical footprint, processes trillions of dollars in value annually. It operates through invisible arteries that run directly beneath the surveillance infrastructure of the United States Treasury, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Global Banking Compliance Network. This entity operates with a degree of impunity that legitimate institutions like J.P. Morgan Chase or HSBC cannot fathom, unencumbered by the regulatory friction of know your customer laws, suspicious activity reports, or international sanctions. It is a system that allows a narcotics trafficker in the remote highlands of Sinaloa to transfer $10 million to a chemical precursor supplier in industrial Wuhan in less time than it takes a legitimate corporation to wire funds from New York to London, all without a single physical banknote or digital dollar formally crossing an international border. To understand how the United States and its Western allies are currently losing a financial war they barely acknowledge fighting, it is necessary to look beyond the sensationalist headlines of drug busts, overdoses, and street-level crime. Instead, one must examine the architecture of a shadow economy that has weaponized one of the oldest concepts in human commerce. This is not strictly a story about crime in the traditional sense, but rather a story about the evolution of money itself, and how the rise of one economic empire and the stagnation of another have created the perfect conditions for the most efficient money laundering machine the world has ever seen. This is the story of the ancient practice of flying money, its modern digital resurrection, and the economic revenge of the East. In the grand timeline of economic history, the concept of moving value without moving physical assets is not a modern innovation. It predates the existence of the United States by nearly a millennium. To truly grasp the sophistication of the modern cartel banking system, one must travel back to the 9th century, to the zenith of the Tang dynasty in China. This era represented a golden age of commerce and culture, yet it suffered from a profound logistical burden that threatened to stifle economic growth. The currency of the realm was copper coinage, cast in round molds with square holes in the center so they could be strung together. While durable, these coins were exceptionally heavy relative to their value. For a merchant trading in high-value commodities like tea, silk, or porcelain across the vast and rugged expanse of the empire, doing business was a logistical nightmare. The value of a large shipment of goods often exceeded the weight of the coins required to purchase them. A merchant wishing to transport the equivalent of a modest fortune from the capital of Chang and to the southern trading hubs would require a convoy of wagons simply to carry the copper strings. These slow-moving caravans were cumbersome, expensive to maintain, and easy targets for the bandits that roamed the trade routes, creating a friction of distance that acted as a heavy tax on commerce. The market, driven by the necessity of efficiency, devised a solution that would change the history of finance. Merchants developed a system they called feiqian, which translates poetically to flying money. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of hauling tons of copper across dangerous terrain, a merchant would deposit his coins with a representative office in the capital and receive a paper voucher, a receipt consisting of 2 parts with unique ink seals and ciphers. He could then travel light, flying to a distant province, present the voucher to a local agent belonging to the same familial or guild network, and withdraw his funds in local currency. It was a system entirely built on trust, guanxi relationships, and regional guilds. No physical money traveled the road, only the information, the claim to value, traveled. The copper remained in the vaults of the capital, and the books were balanced later through offset transactions or the eventual movement of goods. This was the birth of the Bill of Exchange, a concept that would not reach Europe until the Knights Templar and the Italian bankers of Lombardy adopted similar practices centuries later. It was the realization that money is not the physical object, but the information regarding who owes what to whom. Fast forward to the 21st century and the geopolitical landscape has shifted dramatically, but the fundamental friction of money remains a driving force of innovation. Today, the friction is not the physical weight of copper, but the heavy hand of regulation and the surveillance of the state. In the modern era, the Chinese Communist Party enforces some of the strictest capital controls on the planet. In a relentless effort to maintain the stability of the renminbi, control inflation, and prevent capital flight that could destabilize the domestic economy, the state limits its citizens to exchanging the equivalent of only $50,000 per year. For the average citizen, this limit is manageable. However, for the rising Chinese middle class, the ultra-wealthy elite, corrupt government officials, and billionaire entrepreneurs fearing a political purge, This restriction is an existential threat. Consider the position of a wealthy industrialist in Shanghai or a tech mogul in Shenzhen. They may possess $50 million in assets, but they operate in an environment where political winds can shift overnight, leading to asset seizure or imprisonment. They are desperate to move their wealth to a safe haven, typically Western assets such as Vancouver real estate, New York equities, London penthouses, or Australian land. However, the state-controlled banking system prevents them from moving more than a token amount. They are trapped in a liquidity paradox. They have a mountain of wealth in China, but they cannot utilize it in the markets where they feel it is safe. This creates a massive, desperate, and structural demand for US dollars held outside of China. These individuals are willing to pay significant premiums to bypass the state's firewall, creating a vacuum that draws in liquidity from any available source. Simultaneously, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, a mirror image of this problem exists, creating a perfect supply and demand symmetry. Mexican drug cartels, specifically the Sinaloa and the Jalisco New Generation organizations, are drowning in their own success. Over the past 2 decades, their business model has shifted from plant-based drugs like cocaine and heroin, which require vast tracts of land, are subject to weather cycles, and involve complex logistics, to synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Fentanyl is the ultimate capitalist product in the narcotics trade. It is incredibly cheap to manufacture, requires no land to grow, is independent of climate, and is exponentially more potent by weight than traditional opiates. A shoebox of pure fentanyl carries the street value of a truckload of heroin. This hyper-efficiency in production and potency has created a massive logistical problem: cash. The cartels collect billions of dollars in small denominations, 5s, 10s, and 20s, from street sales across the United States. While the product they sell is compact and easy to smuggle, the payment they receive is heavy, bulky, and incriminating. $1 million in $20 bills weighs approximately 110 pounds. $1 billion in mixed denominations is a logistical nightmare that requires fleets of trucks to move. You cannot simply deposit $1 billion of drug money into a Bank of America account without triggering immediate federal investigations. Furthermore, smuggling this bulk cash back across the southern border into Mexico is fraught with risk. Cash-sniffing dogs, X-ray machines at border crossings, and highway interdiction teams seize hundreds of millions of dollars annually. The cartels are left with a cash trap. They have too much physical liquidity in the United States and need to get the value back to Mexico to pay their armies, bribe officials, and crucially buy more raw materials from China. This is where the ancient wisdom of Faiqian meets the modern criminal underworld, creating a convergence that law enforcement agencies struggle to comprehend. It is a match made in economic hell, driven by the complementary needs of 2 distinct groups who would otherwise have no reason to interact. On one side, Chinese elites with money stuck in China who need dollars in the West. On the other side, Latin American cartels with dollars stuck in the West who need to move value to Mexico and China. A new breed of broker emerged to solve both problems simultaneously. These brokers, often Chinese nationals operating in North American hubs like New York, Los Angeles, Toronto, and Vancouver, realized that the solution to the friction of borders was not to smuggle money across them, but to swap it. The mechanism they perfected is elegantly simple, virtually undetectable, and operates on the same principle as the Tang dynasty flying money, but with the speed of modern telecommunications. It works through a system of mirror swaps, balancing books on 2 different continents without the 2 piles of money ever touching. The transaction begins when a Chinese money launderer in a North American city is contacted by a cartel representative. The cartel wishes to launder, for example, $500,000 in street cash. The launderer arranges a handover, often in a mundane location like a fast food parking lot or a nondescript apartment. The cash is handed over in plastic bags or shoeboxes. Once the launderer has the dirty US dollars, he does not attempt to wire them to Mexico. Instead, he turns to his network of wealthy Chinese clients, the industrialist in Shanghai or the nervous bureaucrat in Beijing who is desperate to get money into the US. The launderer sells the cartel's dirty cash to the Chinese client. The Chinese client does not care that the bills smell of gasoline or carry trace amounts of drug residue. He simply wants dollars in America to buy a house or fund a child's tuition. The launderer delivers the physical cash to the Chinese client's relative in the US, or deposits it into a myriad of smurfed bank accounts kept below the $10,000 reporting threshold, which are then consolidated into a check or wire transfer for the client. In exchange for receiving this cash in the US, the Chinese client takes the equivalent value in renminbi from his bank account in China and transfers it to a bank account in China controlled by the launderer. At this moment, the magic of the swap is complete. The Chinese client has successfully moved his wealth to America, bypassing the capital controls of the Communist Party. The launderer now holds a massive pool of clean renminbi in Chinese banks. He uses this renminbi to pay the chemical factories in Hubei, Guangdong, or Hebei that manufacture the precursor chemicals needed to make fentanyl. These chemicals are purchased legally or semi-legally within China and are then shipped to Mexico. The cycle closes when the chemicals arrive at the Mexican ports of Manzanillo or Lázaro Cárdenas. The cartels receive the raw materials they need to manufacture more drugs. The value of their street cash in New York has been effectively transferred to Mexico in the form of goods, without a single dollar ever crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, and without a single renminbi ever crossing the China-U.S. border. The launderer takes a commission from both sides, profiting from the cartel. S need to wash money, and the Chinese elite, AS need to flee capital controls. The transaction is a ghost. It is a dual ledger settlement that leaves almost no paper trail for Western law enforcement to follow. Because the domestic transfers in China are invisible to U.S. authorities, and the cash handovers in the U.S. are unrecorded. This underground financial architecture, while theoretically sound in its reliance on the ancient principles of flying money, required a specific kind of architect to modernize it for the digital age. It needed a figure who could bridge the vast cultural and linguistic chasm between the rigid, hierarchical traditions of Chinese guanxi networks and the brutal, machismo-driven volatility of Latin American cartels. That figure emerged in the form of Xizhi Li, a man who, until his eventual arrest, was arguably the most important financial innovator in the criminal world of the 21st century. Li was a product of globalization in its purest, most unregulated form. Born in China but raising himself on the streets of Mexico, he possessed a rare dual fluency that went beyond mere language. He understood the unspoken codes of conduct in both the tea houses of Guangdong and the safe houses of Sinaloa. Before Li's rise, the cartels were reliant on a network of Colombian money brokers who operated with the inefficiency of a monopoly. These brokers charged extortionate fees, often taking up to 18% of the principal sum to clean the money, and their methods were agonizingly slow. They relied on complex trade-based money laundering schemes involving the purchase of electronics, textiles, or consumer goods that had to be physically shipped and sold to recoup the value. This process could take weeks, leaving millions of dollars in limbo, a float time that exposed the cartels to seizure by law enforcement and fluctuations in market prices. Li saw this inefficiency not as a cost of doing business, but as a massive market opportunity. He realized that the Colombian model was obsolete because it treated money laundering as a service industry rather than a currency exchange market. Li approached the cartels with a proposition that seemed too good to be true. He offered to launder their hundreds of millions of dollars for a fee that was practically negligible, sometimes as low as 1 or 2%, and in certain aggressive expansion phases, he would do it for free. Even more incredibly, he offered a contract of insurance that was unheard of in the criminal underworld. He guaranteed the funds. If the cash was seized by the DEA or local police before the swap was complete, Li promised to replace it from his own pocket. To the cartel bosses, this was a revolution. It eliminated their risk entirely and maximized their profits. They began funneling contracts to Li exclusively, abandoning their old Colombian partners and effectively handing him the keys to the financial infrastructure of the global drug trade. The question that baffled investigators for years was how Li could afford to take such catastrophic risks and charge such razor-thin fees. The answer lay in the mirror swap mechanism and the sheer desperation of his other client base. Li was not making his profit from the cartels. He was making it from the Chinese elite. The demand for U.S. dollars among wealthy Chinese nationals was so intense that they were willing to pay a premium to get their hands on clean American currency. Li was essentially acquiring the cartel's dirty dollars at a discount, since the cartel was willing to pay a small fee to get rid of them, and selling those same dollars to Chinese nationals at a significant markup above the official exchange rate. He was playing a massive arbitrage game, exploiting the spread between the black market exchange rate and the official peg. The cartel got their money cleaned instantly, the Chinese elite got their flight capital, and Li made a fortune on the spread while consolidating power as the central banker of the fentanyl trade. He transformed money laundering from a logistical burden into a high-speed financial instrument, operating a shadow central bank that managed liquidity for two of the most powerful groups on Earth. The scale of this operation is difficult to comprehend in the abstract, but its physical manifestation was most visible in the Canadian city of Vancouver, which served as the beta testing ground for this entire system. Before the U.S. fentanyl crisis hit its catastrophic peak, the Vancouver model was already reshaping the economic reality of British Columbia. This was the laboratory where the methods of the flying money system were refined before being exported to the larger American market. In Vancouver, the convergence of Chinese capital flight and drug money created a surreal economic distortion. High rollers from China would fly into Vancouver International Airport, ostensibly for vacation or gambling trips. They would head directly to the casinos that dotted the lower mainland, such as the River Rock Casino. There they would be met in parking lots or hotel rooms by local loan sharks who handed them hockey bags or suitcases filled with $20 bills. cash that was directly sourced from the street-level drug sales of local gangs. The Chinese gamblers would take this dirty cash into the casinos, buying hundreds of thousands of dollars in chips. They would gamble, sometimes perfunctorily, sometimes aggressively, and then cash out. When they cashed out, the casino would issue them a clean check or wire transfer for their winnings or remaining balance. In a matter of hours, street cash covered in drug residue was converted into a bank draft from a legitimate Canadian financial institution. The gamblers used these funds to buy luxury real estate in Vancouver's most expensive neighborhoods, driving housing prices to stratospheric levels that decoupled entirely from the local wage economy. Entire neighborhoods of multi-million-dollar homes stood empty, serving merely as safety deposit boxes for Chinese wealth that had been swapped with drug money. The Canadian authorities were slow to react, often paralyzed by the complexity of the scheme, the revenue the casinos generated for the province, and diplomatic sensitivities regarding China. By the time the scale of the Vancouver Model was fully understood, billions of dollars had been washed, and the methodology was already migrating south to the much larger market of the United States. However, the evolution of this system did not stop with cash swaps and casinos. As the 21st century progressed, the architects of this shadow economy embraced a technological accelerant that would remove the remaining friction of physical proximity: cryptocurrency. If the paper vouchers of the Tang dynasty were the analog version of flying money, then the stablecoin Tether became its fiber optic upgrade. While Bitcoin garnered the headlines for its volatility and investment potential, Tether became the workhorse of the underground economy. Tether is a stablecoin, a digital token pegged one-to-one with the US dollar. It offers the stability of the world's reserve currency with the speed and anonymity of a blockchain asset. For the networks running the mirror swaps, Tether was a revelation. It allowed value to move instantly across the globe, bypassing the SWIFT banking system entirely. It did not require a bank account, a passport, or physical handover of cash in a parking lot. The integration of cryptocurrency into the flying money system streamlined the supply chain of fentanyl precursors to a terrifying degree. Investigative reports and congressional hearings have revealed that many of the chemical companies in China that manufacture the precursor agents, chemicals like N-phenyl-4-piperidinone and 4-ANPP, openly advertise their willingness to accept cryptocurrency payments. These companies, which number in the thousands and operate in the industrial hubs of Hebei and Hubei, are part of a massive, unruly chemical industry that the central government in Beijing struggles, or chooses not, to fully regulate. They sell their products on the clear web, on social media platforms, and in business-to-business marketplaces, offering 100% stealth shipping guarantees to get the chemicals past customs inspectors in Mexico and the US. When a cartel in Mexico needs to order a new shipment of precursors to synthesize fentanyl, they no longer need to wait for a complex money laundering cycle to clear. They can simply text a broker who arranges an instant transfer of Tether from a digital wallet controlled by the cartel to a digital wallet controlled by the Chinese chemical manufacturer. The settlement happens in seconds. The chemicals are shipped, often mislabeled as innocent products like dog food additives or industrial dyes, and the cycle begins anew. This digital layer has made the flying money system virtually immune to traditional interdiction. You cannot seize a wire transfer that doesn't pass through a bank. You cannot arrest a server. The ledger exists everywhere and nowhere, decentralized across the blockchain, visible to everyone, but controlled by no one. This technological leap has compressed the time it takes to turn street cash into new poison from weeks to minutes, accelerating the velocity of money and, consequently, the velocity of death. The geopolitical dimension of this financial phantom is where the narrative turns darkest, moving from the mechanics of crime to the strategies of empires. Many analysts, historians, and intelligence officials have begun to view this phenomenon through the lens of a reverse opium war. The historical parallel is striking and deeply embedded in the psyche of the Chinese state. In the 19th century, the British Empire facing a massive trade deficit with the Qing dynasty, because the British public had an insatiable appetite for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, while the Chinese had little use for British wool, decided to balance the scales by force and subversion. The British flooded China with opium grown in their Indian colonies. The resulting addiction crisis devastated Chinese society, corroding its economy, its military, and its social fabric. It led to the Opium Wars, the collapse of the dynasty, and what China refers to as the Century of Humiliation. Today, the flows are reversed. The West has an insatiable appetite for cheap goods and, increasingly, for synthetic escape. The chemicals flow from east to west, not as raw opium, but as sophisticated chemical compounds designed in laboratories. While there is no smoking gun document proving that the Chinese Communist Party officially directs this flow as a matter of state policy, the strategic indifference is palpable. The Chinese state maintains the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus in human history. It can track a dissident social media post in seconds, or identify a jaywalker with facial recognition cameras. The idea that it cannot identify and shut down the massive industrial production of fentanyl precursors, which are advertised openly on the internet and paid for via trackable digital tokens, strains credibility. To many observers, the lack of enforcement looks less like incompetence and more like a strategic tolerance, a way to allow a rival superpower to poison itself while profiting from the decline. The flying money system, therefore, is not just a criminal enterprise. It is a geopolitical weapon, a silent, chaotic form of asymmetric warfare that degrades the enemy's population and economy without a single shot being fired. When the hammer of law enforcement finally fell on Xizhi Li in a coordinated strike involving the DEA, Homeland Security, and international partners, the authorities believed they had severed the head of the snake. The arrest was celebrated in press conferences as a monumental victory, a decisive blow against the nexus of Chinese money laundering and Latin American narcotics. They had captured the architect, the man who had streamlined the global wash cycle, and they believed that with his removal, the gears of the machine would grind to a halt. But in the months and years that followed, intelligence analysts noticed something disturbing. The volume of fentanyl crossing the border did not decrease, it increased. The flow of illicit funds did not dry up, it merely fragmented, becoming faster and harder to track. They had not killed the beast, they had merely demonstrated the resilience of the ecosystem Li had helped perfect. The arrest proved a fundamental truth about this new era of shadow banking. The system was no longer dependent on any single individual. It had become decentralized, a self-healing network where the removal of one node simply routed the traffic through 1,000 others. The flying money system had evolved beyond its creators, transforming from a criminal conspiracy into a structural feature of the global economy, an autonomous engine of arbitrage that operated with the cold, unfeeling logic of algorithm. This resilience is partly due to the democratization of the trade. The knowledge that Li pioneered, the mechanics of the mirror swap, the use of tether, the contacts in the Chinese chemical industry, did not die with his incarceration. It had already disseminated through the underworld, adopted by a new generation of freelance brokers and smaller, more agile networks. These microcells do not have the massive footprint of Li's organization, making them infinitely harder to target. They operate out of encrypted chat apps like WeChat, Telegram, and Signal, coordinating multi-million-dollar swaps with the casual brevity of a text message. They are the gig workers of the money laundering world, and their sheer number makes traditional enforcement strategies, which rely on targeting kingpins and seizing centralized assets, woefully obsolete. The United States government is trying to fight a swarm of mosquitoes with a sledgehammer, expending massive resources to crush individual actors while the swarm itself continues to feed. The futility of the current containment strategy is mirrored in the chemical arms race that parallels the financial one. Just as the financial network evolves to bypass banking regulations, the chemical network evolves to bypass drug laws. The Chinese laboratories that supply the cartels are not static entities. They are staffed by brilliant organic chemists who understand the iron law of prohibition. This sociological theorem states that as enforcement against a substance becomes more intense, the substance will become more potent and more compact to maximize the profit-to-risk ratio. When the US and China, under diplomatic pressure, finally moved to schedule fentanyl and its most common precursors as controlled substances, the labs simply pivoted. They tweaked a molecule here, shifted a bond there, and created analogs, chemical cousins of fentanyl that were technically legal because their specific molecular structure had not yet been written into the criminal code. When the dragnet tightened around fentanyl analogs, the labs moved on to entirely new classes of synthetic opioids, such as nitazines, or began mixing the supply with veterinary tranquilizers, like xylazine, creating the necrotic trank dope that is currently rotting the flesh of users in Philadelphia and San Francisco. This is the dark innovation of the shadow market. The flying money system finances this endless cycle of adaptation. It provides the frictionless capital required for cartels to experiment, to pivot, and to flood the market with new compounds faster than Western legislatures can draft bills to ban them. The result is a regulatory game of whack-a-mole played at the speed of light, where the moles are chemical weapons and the hammer is a bureaucracy that takes years to make a decision. The societal impact of this economic engine creates a haunting juxtaposition in the landscapes of the two superpowers. In the United States, the consequence is visible in the hollowing out of the Rust Belt and the Appalachian towns, where the overdose crisis has decimated the workforce, strained the healthcare system to its breaking point, and eroded the social fabric of entire communities. The wealth of these communities is being vacuumed up $20 at a time, converted into cryptocurrency, and beamed across the ocean. This is an extraction economy, but instead of extracting coal or timber, it is extracting the vitality of the American working class. In contrast, follow the money to its destination, and you find the glittering skylines of Shanghai, the booming property markets of Toronto and Sydney, and the luxury districts of Vancouver. The flying money does not just disappear, it reemerges as asset inflation. The dirty dollars that destroy lives in Ohio become the clean capital that builds condos in British Columbia. It is a massive transfer of wealth from the bottom of American society to the top of the Chinese and global asset holding class. The addict in the alleyway is, in a grim economic sense, the end consumer who finances the real estate speculator's portfolio. The system connects the most wretched despair with the most opulent luxury, binding them together in a silent, invisible transaction that enriches the brokers in the middle. This phenomenon exposes a fatal blind spot in the Western worldview. For decades, the United States believed that integrating China into the global economy would inevitably lead to China becoming more Western, more democratic, more rules-based, more transparent. The flying money system suggests the opposite has happened. The global economy has not tamed the Wild West of Chinese capitalism. Rather, the opacity and ruthlessness of the Chinese shadow economy have infected the global system. The reliance on informal networks, the bypassing of laws through technicalities, the fusion of state interests and criminal enterprise, these are features that are spreading outward. The Vancouver Model was not an anomaly, it was a forecast. It demonstrated how easily the institutions of the West, its banks, its casinos, its real estate markets, could be subverted and weaponized against their own societies by actors who play by a completely different set of rules. Ultimately, the story of the greatest bank in the world is a story about the decline of the US dollar's moral hegemony. The United States has long used the dollar and the SWIFT banking system as a tool of foreign policy, sanctioning enemies and freezing assets to enforce its will. The rise of the flying money system, powered by tether and mirror swaps, represents the market's answer to that weaponization. It proves that if you squeeze the formal channels of finance too hard, the water will simply find another crack in the rock. The shadow banking system has grown so large, so efficient, and so deeply integrated into the legitimate economy that it may simply be impossible to dismantle without shattering the global financial system itself. It is a parasitic organism that has fused with the host. As we look to the future, the ghost in the machine is likely here to stay. The fentanyl crisis, the money laundering, the capital flight, these are not temporary emergencies to be solved, but chronic conditions to be managed. They are the overhead costs of a globalized world where capital is free, but people are trapped. The merchant in the Tang dynasty who first exchanged his heavy copper coins for a paper voucher could never have imagined that his invention would one day facilitate the poisoning of a rival empire across an ocean that was not yet on his map. Yet the principle remains unchanged. Value seeks the path of least resistance. Today, that path runs through the encrypted wallets of the flying money brokers, a silent subterranean river of wealth that flows beneath our feet, eroding the foundations of the world we thought we knew, while the surface remains deceptively, terrifyingly calm. This is the new economic reality, a world where the borders on the map are solid, but the borders of the ledger have dissolved into air. Thanks for watching Econ Empire. If you found this analysis insightful, please hit the like button and leave a comment below. It really helps the algorithm share this story with more people. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden mechanics of the global economy. See you in the next one.